thought that was a really good discussion, and I think sort of what Tom was saying about how it sort of feels different, that even preparing this meeting sort of felt quite different to sort of ones I prepared before. I think 'cause there's more open and more questions that we can be asking. I don't have answers, I suppose, to the questions that have been posed, but I suppose to go to some way, I think the question that Jonas asked about how, I think it raises sort of, I think, like, it indicates something quite important about what we're trying to do. I think it shows that we want to grow, and I think that in itself, I think, is a quite important point, that we're not happy with just like the small numbers of people that we've got, that we see that there's a much wider audience out there for that we want to be involved with revolutionary politics. But I think understanding that it's not an automatic process by which that happens. People aren't just going to reproduce the nicest looking leaflet and people will come and flock to us. That it is something we actually have to think about. And I don't know the answer, but I think it's something that we should, over the next period, be thinking about. I think it's true, like, I do think it genuinely is true that people have illusions in the Labour Party, and I think that will intensify over the next 12 months. This is possibly more strongly felt having spent the last couple of days at a US event where they talk about the general election constantly. But I think it's also then true that there is the question of anti-politics, and the R21 meeting we had in Cambridge last week, that was on anti-politics, and it was an interesting discussion in that, I think what came out of it is that, well, it says anti-politics, it's clearly, what Jonas was saying is completely right, that these aren't anti-political movements, they're movements which are, and what people think, they're very political. They understand that there is a democratic deficit in society, that the people that we're told represent us don't represent us, and I think it's therefore really important that we're trying to be involved with these movements and talk to people in them. Like, I think the point that Colin was making, saying about that we do agree on 99% of the time things is quite important. I remember like when we've been occupying things in Cambridge, I get very frustrated with people because they're autonomists and they're, but then actually when you think about it, they're people who want to change the system. They're people who think that democracy is important, and actually, rather than getting annoyed at each other and sort of having little debating sort of nuances things, we can actually think about what we agree on and try and work constructively and discuss and debate with one another. I think it's important to be understanding how the nature of the working class has changed. And I think we do this best by being rooted within the movements and within the working class. I think what people were saying, I think that the revolutionary potential of the working class is something that still exists. And I think that's something that's important that we hold on to. But I think it's also important that to recognise that struggle does take many forms, and I think there's things around the fracking, a very good concrete example of what's happening in Manchester, where it is seeing people being mobilised about this, and I think we do need to recognise the potential in this. I think another example is the movements around women's liberation, feminism that have exploded in the last few years, that there's to be particularly, but I think the wider revolutionary left just hasn't sort of taken the time to understand, and I think what we're doing is, I feel that we are sort of trying to think about this much more seriously. I think it's important because the sparks, I think, that can sort of set things off won't necessarily come from where theoretically we think they will be, and so we have to be open and understand things that are happening. I think on the question, I'm somebody who's quite critical about newspapers, but I think that they have I think that's sort of what you said about sort of building a network, having somebody that you regularly sold a paper to that was interested in those ideas. I think that's quite important. That it's not necessarily just the content of a newspaper or something that's important. It's about, and I think it's what you find often doing stores and things. It's about using it as a tool with which to engage in a conversation with somebody. It's having an opportunity to sort of say. Often you say, would you like a paper? And they might say no, but then it's an easy way to sort of start a conversation with somebody about something political. I was trying to do it with these postcards at the NUS thing, and it worked to some extent, but it was more that somebody had never heard the word Marxism before, so we had to start from it was good, but and I think the sort of the desire to sort of talk to people and interact with them, I think, is also then quite important, that we are, like going back to what James was saying, it's about that we want to grow and we want to try and engage with other people. I think a national organisation is important, because I think it allows us to draw on the experience from each other, that it's not just what's happening in Manchester, what's happening in Cambridge, what's happening in Bristol, that we're actually trying to think about, because like the state is not just, it doesn't just exist in Cambridge, it doesn't just exist in Manchester, like these things are going to be affecting us on a national scale, and I think to have a sharpest way of intervening in the struggles, then it's quite important. But it also allows us to have more, to have an impact and to draw together debates and discussions, and that I think is one of the best ways that we are going to think about how can we advance the revolutionary struggle forward in Britain today.
I don't think what I was trying to say is that we jump into a library, have all the answers, and then tell them to the working class. I think that would be ridiculous, and I don't think we'd be that arrogant, to be honest with you. I made this point about learning from the class and then trying to contribute to struggles we're involved in and stuff like that. And I think that a lot of people I've been having conversations with recently, where you've seen the development of Unite Community, and you've seen activists who are involved in Unite Community, involved in housing campaigns against landlords and stuff like that, and in support of tenants. So for an example, learning from the class, after the Indignados movement in Spain and the movement fragmented, there was big struggles in working class districts around housing conditions and tenants conditions and stuff like that, and it was quite a big mobiliser coming out of what was quite a big struggle. And I think that a comrade Luke Stolbert's writing something on it at the moment, who's also involved in stuff in Spain. So I think that's a concrete example of where we can learn from struggles about what people have done around housing campaigns and stuff like that in other countries, and bring that back to the strategic lessons we're learning here. Because if we were sitting in, because what I said about the small cell analogy, if we sit inside a cell and talk to each other all day, and we ain't got no ability to be able to talk to people outside, but we're irrelevant, and we're just as ossified as the organisation we just came out of in a lot of ways. That's one point. I think that I suppose I want to recount my experiences at University of East London, where I studied and now I work, in terms of how do we relate to such a fragmented situation in terms of the nature of the class and union organisation and stuff like that. So I find myself in a situation where I work night shifts, I don't have a line manager, I'm on a 0-hour contract, and I have no fellow workers, which means I can pretty much I do nothing in terms of work, but it also means I can do nothing in terms of organising. There's no one to concretely where my labour is exploited. I mean, the amount of work I do, we could debate that. But but there's very little I can concretely do in terms of people that are immediately in my workplace, because there isn't any. So what does that mean? There's several things that I can relate to. Canteen staff that are trying to develop some level of union organisation. Across the river from the university, the city airport, the cleaners in City Airport have been involved in basically trying to get the London living wage and stuff like that. And there's also a big crisis developing in the university, and left academics are talking about the threat of the closure of the university and stuff like that, which is quite drastic for a university. So there's a whole number of questions there that if I can't do something immediately where I work, I can relate to things around me and try and build forms of organisation and try and relate to people within different struggles. So that's just one example, and that's part of making sure we're learning the lessons from those struggles and the attacks that are happening at universities, and trying to think about that is both on the one hand not being a mindless militant, but then on the other hand being involved in that and contributing towards that is not sitting in a small cell. Do you know what I mean? And it's a constant process of actually trying to learn the lessons from struggle and contribute to a wider picture of how we start to answer the questions that we're faced with. A couple of other things that I wanted to say. I slightly wanted to disagree with Colin about the IS. Cause speaking to Ian Birchall, and maybe Ian Birchall's more romantic about that period than you are, but he's quite blunt about the fact that through the 50s and the 60s, the IS was through the process of developing quite a distinct revolutionary current that differed from, say, the Fourth International and other groups in terms of particularly not making any concessions to other social forces involved in those struggles. For example, whether it be imperialism, Russian imperialism, armed struggle in Latin America, or different questions. And the IS was quite solidified in talking about mass agency and mass working class agency compared. And I think that there's some of the questions we face today, not in the same form. Obviously, we don't have big state capitalist regimes, etc. But how do you still develop a revolutionary current that doesn't make any concessions to different social forces? Because in the state of fragmentation we face at the moment, people are all over the place politically, and we have to start debating this stuff out, thrashing it out, and trying and developing a revolutionary current. The last point I want to say is the question of revolution today. I mean, I don't have an answer to it, but I would say two things that I think are interesting in terms of barricades and revolutionary violence is that if you look at Syria, counter-revolutionary regimes will do their utmost to turn it into small forms of violence rather than mass struggle. And you see that in Syria in terms of trying to place it onto the point of civil war in particular, rather than mass revolution, and it's a constant aim by the regime. The second thing is, one of the most creative things I've seen in the last year is a book block. I don't know if anyone's seen it. On the student demonstrations, you've got what are traditionally the black bloc running down the road with essentially what looks like a barricade, but on the front of the barricade it's got a picture of, say, Lenin and the State and Revolution on it, or it's got Orwell in 1984 where they've mastered it. So I think that whilst I think barricades will be there, I also think through struggle people come up with new creative forms of fighting back, and I think that's partly what we have to learn from.